A very good afternoon, everyone, dear students, teachers, and anybody who has stumbled upon this video today. This video is to be treated as the first part to the original special lecture organized by the Department of English, Uluberia College, which unfortunately, due to a technical glitch, was deleted or not saved properly. And therefore, the one which is available on YouTube right now begins rather abruptly. So in order to maintain the continuity of the special lecture, Anwita and I, Anonna Shosharu, Faculty Department of English, Uluberia College, have decided to connect over Zoom so that we can fill up the missing links or whatever was left behind. So I'm going to introduce Anwita formally. Um, Dr. Anwita Ghosh is a Marian L. Britton postdoctoral fellow at the Georgia Institute of Technology, USA. She earned her PhD in English from Fordham University in 2025, following a bachelor's from the University of Calcutta and a master's and MPhil from Jadavpur University. Her research focuses on 20th and 21st century Anglophone modernisms, kinship studies, psychoanalysis, and postcolonial studies. Her dissertation examines how certain modernist fictions reimagine kinship as contingent, non-normative alternatives shaped through proximity, risk, and shared precarity. Analyzing the works of E.M. Forster, Rabindranath Tagore, Nela Larsen, Jean Rhys, and Claude McKay. Along with her research and teaching, Dr. Ghosh also serves as the Assistant Director of the Nogel Writing and Communication Center and holds honorary posts in the Writing Center community. Welcome, Ornita, I think for the second time, and thank you. Despite your busy schedule, we are bothering you quite a bit. But I would also like to mention that I have known Ornita for a very long time, and we began our academic career together. But then we parted ways as she moved to the US to pursue her PhD, and I stayed back in India to do the same. But I feel like we have had a very steady long distance friendship in spite of that. That has only become more ambitious and eclectic over the years, with our conversations ranging from literature, cinema, books, to relationship, life, and of course, boy problems. But there's just one thing which has connected us deeply, our shared love for psychoanalysis, which eventually transpired into modernism. And when we were talking about this special lecture, we chose modernism primarily because we had this observation, both from the perspective of a student and now that of a teacher. We have observed that somehow students are a bit apprehensive towards the modernist era. And while they seem to be perpetually familiar with, let's say, a Victorian or Romantic or Elizabethan, somehow the modernist era is all that scary with the big shots like Woolf and Joyce and Lawrence and T.S. Eliot. So one of the reasons of this seminar is to demystify that era called modernism so that students can approach it with less fear and perhaps more enthusiasm and curiosity. The title of Anita's lecture is The Long and Short of Modernism. And the moment I heard about it, my mind directly went to the idea of time, because chronologically speaking, although modernism is the shortest period, we tend to keep it between 1900 to 1945, perhaps. But in a broader sense, it obviously covers longer depth that Anvita is going to talk about today. So without further ado, I would ask her to begin her lecture, which is almost like a prequel now because you will see the second part on YouTube, but we'll try our best to recreate the first one. Over to you, Anvita.
Thank you, Anonna, for that generous and sometimes a little unflattering introduction. But I am deeply appreciative of the time you and your colleagues in the Department of English, especially HOD Sir, Principal Ma'am of Uluberia College, the effort you guys have put in to organize this event on such short notice. So And also thanks to the student community and whoever stumbles upon this video um, for spending your time with me on this otherwise obtuse topic of modernism. Um, all right. I hope our conversation today does not end when my lecture does. More than anything, I hope it generates disagreements, questions, conversations that continue beyond this hour, and even perhaps marks the beginning of lasting intellectual friendships and collaborations. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can jump right into it. Is my screen looking all right? Or
Yes, it's perfectly visible.
okay, thank you, Anurna. So I should confess something at the very outset. This isn't really a lecture, or in the way that we perceive the word lecture. I don't have a thesis that I want to establish by the end of my talk. What I have instead is my personal encounter and the journey with this tag we use in our field, modernism, or scholar of modernist studies. What I'm going to do throughout this lecture is dissect this complicated love hate relationship that I share with this term. And why do I feel a little bit of hesitation when I am forced to kind of describe myself through a single word? So, you know, that's the descriptor of modernism as my field of research. And increasingly, that nickname has made me feel a little hesitant, and I flinch at it as if I have outgrown that nickname. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, let me start at a somewhat unglamorous place, which is the North American job market. So, as you all heard from Anurna, I completed my doctoral dissertation in 2025, and ever since I have spent inordinate amount of time browsing through job ads, facing different hiring committees, and trying to make sense of what I am working in and how the world perceives me as a scholar or researcher in the field of modernism. Um, Very briefly speaking, because this is slightly different from the Indian job market, the North American job market works on tags and specialized research topics. So in India, we usually get ads like assistant English professor or associate professor of English. Full stop. That's the end. You are expected to teach Shakespeare in the morning, Toni Morrison in the evening, uh, basically wear multiple hats. In the North American classroom, you are hired based on a particular specialization. So if you notice, here are some of the snapshots I took as examples. The first one is on speech language pathology. Again, it says open rank, but still it asks you for that specialization. The second one that comes out from Mount Holyoke College is very particular as well. It is creative nonfiction. So basically, interested in areas such as memoir, personal essay. The third one on the right-hand standard corner from Wesleyan is a tenure track in um, early modern studies. And then the last one at the very bottom, we have another tenure track in environmental studies. So what I'm trying to say is particular specialization and how that transpires into your hiring, unlike the Indian job market where you get to be a generalist. You do not necessarily have to specialize in order to apply for different jobs. So, as you can understand, just from a glimpse of these variety of job ads, I have often found myself, repeatedly asking, how do I describe what I do in a single word? It is almost like making myself a marketable product. My own answer, when I'm honest, is modernism. And increasingly, I have learned to hesitate before saying it out loud. This meme perfectly captures that. And hopefully, this talk will um, unveil why I use the term, why I have this love hate relationship. So the hesitation isn't personal insecurity. It's a reflection of the field's own situation. By the field, I mean the field of modernist studies. Again, as Anurna mentioned, briefly speaking, from 1900 till 1945. So to call yourself a modernist today is to identify, by most accounts, with one of the shortest periods in the history of English literature. Um, to the students of Uluberia College, I would definitely ask you to go back to that beautiful art installation in your room number 9 class, where you have this beautiful railway track, kind of having different, moments in the history of English literature. And if you notice, the modernist period spans between 1914 and 45, which is again shorter than the one I just proposed. So it's a really, really short period, if not the shortest in the span of English literature. So, set alongside other epochs like the long 19th century, aka the Victorian age, or area studies like, Latinx and indigenous studies, the period of modernism looks like more like an interval than a period. So hiring committees, not unreasonably, ask me, why would we hire you, who is a specialized in this 45 year box or bracket, when another candidate can teach across a century or more? I don't want to answer that question defensively by claiming, what about those 45 years? Extraordinary things happened, and that's what makes it special. It's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. I think that's a lazy response and slightly defensive. Instead, I want to ask why we have come to think this way at all. What happens when we imagine literary periodization as a series of bounded brackets and boxes and categorizations? What do those boundaries let us see, and what do they obscure? And why has modernism, more than any other field, become the site where those assumptions get challenged most vigorously? So, those are my questions for this talk today. And that's why I have named my talk The Long and Short of Modernism. So far, we have established the short of it, which is 1900 to 1945 by most accounts. I want to spend the rest of my talk on how that short period has cast a long shadow and complicated the business of literary periodization itself. So here's the roadmap of my talk so that we know how I have arranged my thoughts and what to expect after what. I have arranged my talk similar to like a 5-act play. We will begin in the first act, which is why modernism, asking not who the modernists were, because I'm pretty sure, your professors will tell you, and I mean, that is the popular story. You will get to hear about Joyce, Woolf, and others in your classroom. So I'm less interested in who the modernists are and more interested in why this collection of writers ever got grouped together at all. As scholars and professors like Sean Latham and Gail Rogers put it, the real question isn't what is modernism, but how did the idea of modernism come into being? From there, we'll proceed to Act 2, which I have named Inventing Modernism, where we will try to see how universities turn that unstable idea of a group of modernist writers into a recognizable period. Canon formation came first. Certain writers like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound got singled out as representative, hardening them into a style called the high modernism, which then got fitted into temporal borders, giving us the classroom version, which is Eurocentric, very white, often male, textually obscure, linguistically flamboyant, and bounded between roughly 1900 and 1945. So that's what I'm going to talk about in Act Two. But that story doesn't end there. Around the turn of this century, um, especially to be precise, 1999, we get to see a group of scholars who began asking whether that version, which is the short modernism, 1900 1945, has become too small, too narrow, too detached from the political and colonial worlds that produced it. Briefly speaking, early part of the 20th century, we are getting loads of decolonial uprisings and movements, and also the small island of Great Britain kind of shrinking in its currency and power. That's how I'm going to transition from Act 3 to Act 4. Is the short version of modernism getting too narrow and too Eurocentric? So that what led to this formation in the 1990s. It's called the New Modernist School, New Modernist Studies, which expanded the field of modernism, aka the short modernism, along three axes. This concept of the three axes, I have borrowed this from critics Douglas Mao and Rebecca Walkowitz, and those three axes are temporal, spatial, and vertical. We'll get into each of those axes during that particular act, which is the long modernism. So, yeah, we'll come back to that. Absolutely. Um, so basically, briefly speaking, spatially means outward across the globe, outward uh, from the Anglophone world, backward and forward in time, which I mean temporal expansion. And then vertical means expansion in archival sources. So this is the time of the proliferation of mass media. So no longer just textual, novels or poetry, but also newspaper or press clippings or phonography, different forms of archival sources informing our notion of modernism. And this is how modernism becomes modernisms. The pluralization happens in Act 4, the long modernism. Now, that expansion created a new problem. If modernism now describes African modernisms, queer modernisms, media modernisms, and phenomena well outside the early 20th century, has the category become so capacious, so expansive, that it has lost its coherence? When everything is modernist, is anything still modernist? That question leads us to the final part of my lecture, where I'll introduce two responses, and I have called this part After Modernism. So my two responses to the question, if everything is modernist, is anything modernist at all? Those two responses kind of mirror each other. One says modernism is simply over and gives what followed a new name, metamodernism. The other one, acknowledging the post colonial threat of the early 20th century, says modernism was never one thing to begin with. Drawing on historian Dipesh Chakravarty and critic Susan Stanford Friedman, we will ask what it means to provincialize modernism. One response, which is the metamodernist thread, resolves the crisis in time. The other response, which is the provincializing tendency, resolves the crisis in space. By the end, I want to return to where I started today's talk, but from the other side. Why do I still reach for the term modernism, and what is a literary period actually for? If a period this unstable can still hold together and still be worth defending. All right, let's start our journey together with Act 1. You have already heard about my job market story, which is still ongoing, so wish me luck. But it's worth naming why a hiring committee can even ask, why just 45 years? Periods in literary history, literary studies, aren't just descriptions. They are institutional units, what a curriculum is built on, what a hire is measured against, how you organize graduate reading lists. So before asking whether modernism deserves its box, we should ask something more basic. Who drew it? Who drew that box and when? The honest answer is that nobody drew it all at once. It got invented in layers by different people for different reasons, often without much agreement about what they were even naming. And that is the story that I will try to briefly elaborate in Act 2, which I call Inventing Modernism. It's tempting to imagine modernism as something that happened to a group of artists who were discovered and then labeled decades later. You know, this might remind you of Dryden naming the metaphysical poets. Look, so the naming happened decades later. That's not the case with this bunch of modernist writers. Some of the labeling was already underway thanks to some of the modernists themselves in real time as a form of branding. So it's almost like the Cockroach Janta Party naming itself as the Cockroach Janta Party. So who are these people in real time in the early 20th century who kind of branded themselves as the up and coming modernists? My favorite example, and this is the PPT that kind of shows it, which is in 1937, looking back at London of 1910, writer and painter Wyndham Lewis wrote a memoir grouping himself, Eliot, Pound, and Joyce as, if you see, men of 1914. This was deliberate self canonization, and its vehicle was a little magazine called Blast, as you can see on the PPT, which ran exactly for 2 issues and I quote, hurled manifestos and curses all in enormous black and red type at each and every offender against modernism. So before modernism was a period, it was a little magazine with terrible manners. Again, I'm constantly reminded of the current Gen Z movement and how we are associating the use of slang with this movement. But if you carefully pay attention to these other precedent movements, using non-traditional language, using a language which is, bereft of ornamentation, has always been part of the, youngsters, has always been part of new movements based on rebellion. So yeah, this is how Wyndham Lewis kind of already taking part in self-canonization, calling himself and others in his group men of 1914. And this is how the invention happened. I want you all to pay particular attention to the word invention. Let's take another example. Why the word invention? Ezra Pound's own manifesto for imagism, which is a form of writing, just like, other parallel forms, other similar forms could be, expressionism, cubism, other forms of expression. Imagism is typically Pound's own creation, where about which he insists on invention. This is what he writes. The image is the poet's pigment. The point of imagism is that it does not use images as ornaments. The image is itself the speech. And again, if you remember, Pound was in charge of two hugely famous little magazine, The Little Review and The Egoist. So you can already see how the archive that we usually call the official archive as only novels and poetry and essays, they are getting expanded because I'm including little magazines into it. So here we have found describing imagism as an aesthetic form, but it's not an existing form. It's not Pound reading and then coming up with this. It's Pound inventing this form of aesthetic expression simultaneously as he's writing in it. So this is what I mean by invention. There is this sense of simultaneity, which I'm trying to underscore here. So modernism at its origin point, if we consider, uh, early part of the 20th century as the origin point, is at least partly an advertisement for itself. So we have Wyndham Lewis, Pound, and others kind of advertising, hey, this is how we want to uh, position ourselves. This is our ideology. This is our aesthetic response and whatnot. So again, very curated branding happening in real time. But, and this is important, yes, it's an advertisement. Yes, it kind of throwing a crop of little magazines or little by little magazine I mean non official or more traditional form of literary expression. But at the same time, we need to understand this response is aligned with what is happening historically. It's a response to the historical materialistic reality rather than a group of scholars sitting in their ivory tower and looking down on readers who are not that educated. That's the false notion or a mystified version of modernism we have, especially when we talk about Joyce, as if, filing his nails and looking down on his readers. No, not at all. These writers and their writings are a response to a stark and devastating reality, by which I mean World War One. Lewis's account, if you remember, Wyndham Lewis, if you notice the cover on the left-hand side, that's a very brutal, with jagged end expression of war reality. So Lewis's account is unusually candid about the modernist writers trying to make sense of the Great War. He observes, looking back on Bloss, the little magazine's aggressive aesthetic, he observed that readers would be, and I quote, astonished to find out how like art is to war. I mean, modernist art. They talk a lot about how a war just finished affects art, which is World War One just finished and it has affected art. But you will learn here how a war about to start can do the same thing. End of quote. How prescient. Lewis, as if anticipating World War II and letting his readers know, yes, a war affects the language, but the language also harbors in it the seed of the future war. We are already getting a complication of time here, but what I'm trying to kind of emphasize here is a lot of these literary and aesthetic responses are in response to the war, to the Great War, and also to the war that came after it. So if war is one axis, there are multiple axes, as in multiple historical anchors that led to this crop of modernist writers or crop of writing, which formally might look obtuse and obscure or difficult, and linguistically might challenge our intellectual prowess. But that is what happens when a language is at the, gets assaulted by the historical reality, in this case, the Great War. There are multiple accesses, and I'm being very, very selective here. The other two axes that I'm going to talk about is the field of physics, the scientific community, and psychoanalysis. So this marks the end of the prequel or part one of my talk. And if you go to YouTube and search for uh, my other lecture part, which we have titled Part 2, you will be able to follow my talk from this point. So I end this part with war as my axis. I'll begin the next part with physics as my second axis to explore how modernist um, writings are responding to the revolution happening in the field of physics. So with that, I will stop sharing and then uh, wait. How do you stop share? You know what? Let's keep this and I'll stop recording.